Good evening. I'm Roger Casey. It's my privilege to serve as the president here at McDaniel, and I'd like to welcome you to tonight's SmartTALK. Someone just told me I look like a rock star until I realized they were talking about these new microphones we're trying out tonight, but I'll go with the dream. It's good. So it's great to welcome you to a place that, according to the Weather Channel, has the number 6 best college for tailgating in America. Yeah. According to Kiplinger's Personal Finance magazine, has one of the top 100 best values in liberal arts education in America. And according to the people who are friends on my Facebook site, we are the number 1 college in the world. So I am delighted to see you here. Our format, if you haven't been to one of these events, our guest speaker will have an opportunity at the beginning to talk a little bit about their own life story and experience and area of expertise. And then after that, we both shift over to the living room over here, where we'll have a chance to engage in a conversation that is designed around questions that you've sent to us. So won't be calling you out by name, but we thank you for submitting a great round of questions, and we will be engaging the dialogue based around those. So thank you so much for submitting questions, and thank you for being here tonight. Never tell Bernard Franklin it's only a game. As a senior vice president of the National Collegiate Athletic Association, he is dedicated to making sure that competition among the nation's college and university athletics programs plays out in a fair, safe, equitable, and sportsmanlike manner. Bernard's 15 years of experience as president of 3 higher education institutions, most recently Virginia Union University, inform his goal of maximizing the educational experience of the student athlete. His own triumphs, breaking the color barrier to become the first African American serving in various professional roles, fuel his commitment to diversity and inclusion among the ranks of coaches, student athletes, and athletic departments. In 2010, Dr. Franklin was appointed to lead the NCAA's new Office of Inclusion. His goal, to create a culture that seeks out different and diverse perspectives as an important step in problem solving, and encouraging policies that support inclusion as a value in decision-making. Bernard points out that much of the NCAA's laudable efforts of the past have focused on how to get more women and people of color into leadership positions in intercollegiate athletics. As he continues that work, he seeks to raise awareness that diversity does not necessarily guarantee an inclusive culture. His team is working to determine how we change these cultures and how we develop measurements for assessing our progress. Since his days as an undergraduate studying religion at Simpson College in Indianola, Iowa, Bernard has pursued his own end game with intelligence and integrity. We here at McDaniel are proud that he chose to earn his master's degree in educational administration here on our Hill in 1978, when at that point in time he also worked and lived in Rouser. I have assured him Rouser has not changed at all since the time that he was here. He then advanced to Columbia University's Teachers College for a doctorate of education. Every one of his former institutions, and more than 1,000 around the nation, benefit every day from his work on the dream team of the NCAA. Dr. Bernard Franklin.
Good evening. It's really refreshing to be known as a member of a dream team. So I thank you very much, Roger, for that reference. Let me begin by, first of all, thanking President Casey for extending to me this tremendous opportunity to come back in many ways to what I can refer to as home. I had such a wonderful experience here as a graduate student, and so this is a tremendous honor to come back. In many ways, it's almost somewhat equivalent to an experience that I had at my undergraduate institution, Simpson College, where I had the opportunity to serve as a Carver lecturer, also a member of the Board of Trustees, and more recently to serve as the commencement speaker. And I mention that because there is a Simpson College connection to McDaniel College for me. When I scheduled my interview to come here to work in the residence halls, I was a little bit struck by my interview schedule that included time with the college president. And I thought that was somewhat unusual because I was only interviewing for a grad assistantship. Why does the president want to meet with me? Well, it dawned on me that at that time, the president of this institution was Dr. Ralph C. John. And Dr. John had served as president of Simpson College during my first 2 years as an undergraduate student. And I must admit, I perhaps was a thorn in the side of Dr. John because of my advocacy of issues around diversity and inclusion. And on many occasions, we did butt heads. And so when I made that connection, I said, I'm not going to get this job. But what fascinated me about the meeting I had with Dr. John was that he did not focus on the differences that we had had. He told me how much he respected me and felt that I would be a wonderful addition to this college community. I will always remember that conversation and was very glad that he had somewhat of a limited memory of the conversations we had had when I was an undergraduate student. But this is really a great honor for me because as I reflect on my own life's journey, McDaniel College was fundamental and foundational to where I was able to go in terms of my own professional career. It was very interesting seeing Dr. Leitner, one of my former professors here, and I jokingly said to him that I can remember burning a lot of midnight oil because of the ed research class that I had with him. And I also want to say in the presence of President Casey, how wonderful your staff has been in terms of hosting me for this event. Joyce has just absolutely been wonderful. And the athletic director, where is my new best friend? We spent the day together, and I've just really enjoyed his company, and certainly meeting student athletes and coaches has been a real wonderful experience as part of revisiting the campus. I chose, at that time, Western Maryland College, now McDaniel College, for a graduate program because at that time, I had a tremendous interest in school administration. And as I did research about graduate programs, I came across this graduate program here in school administration. And what attracted me was that as I learned more about the program, was a fact that many of the faculty members were in fact current practitioners. And I thought, wouldn't this be a wonderful experience to learn from people who are doing what I want to do? And so I came here for that purpose. But it was here that I believe, found my passion for higher ed administration. And if you can survive Rousel Hall for 2 years as hall advisor, you certainly can develop a passion for higher education administration. And so I left here and went to work in the residence hall system of Boston University. And from there, as Dr. Casey indicated, moved to Teachers College, Columbia University to complete my doctorate. I left there and went to Miami University and became the first African-American faculty member in the School of Education and Allied Professions at that institution. But it was very interesting because, like school administration, higher education is also a practitioner's field. And while I thought that I had great theoretical foundation, I felt there was something absent in my life because I had not been a practitioner. And so at that point in my career, I thought, I'm just going to go out and work in administration for 4 or 5 years and then return back to my first love, which was teaching. And I've been telling people for the last 27 years, I have been trying to get back into the classroom. But hopefully one day that will happen for me. But this experience gave me the confidence, the courage, and the commitment to feel that I could excel in any situation or environment. I have been blessed in my lifetime to serve 3 institutions as president and have been at the NCAA now going on 9 years. If you had asked me 9.5 years ago, would I be working at the NCAA, I would have said, without doubt, any doubt at all, no. It was not on my radar screen. I really had no aspirations to work at the NCAA. Now, I had spent during my years as a college or university president 5.5 years as a member of the Division II President's Council and 2 years as a member of the executive committee of the NCAA. I had been in and out of Indianapolis more times than I can recall as part of my service to the governance structure. And so when Miles Brand became president of the NCAA, he was the first sitting university president to be elected president of the NCAA. He conducted a restructuring and created a position for senior vice president for governance and membership. And under that particular administrative rubric were 3 areas. The governance structure, as probably many of you know, we have 3 divisions within the NCAA. At that time, the area was membership services that looked at issues related to waivers, interpretation of legislation, secondary violations, et cetera. And then research. We do a great deal of research at the national office. And so when I was initially contacted by the search firm, I was flattered that there was some interest in my candidacy, but I did not have any interest. See, at that time, just months before being contacted, I had signed a 5-year extension on my contract as president of Virginia Union University. We were in the quiet phase of a capital campaign, and I had said to my wife when we moved there, we didn't live in the president's house, so I said to my wife, I want you to sit down with the architect and design your ideal home, because you're only going to get one of those in this marriage. And so do that. So we had done that. There was no way I was going home to my wife and say, we're thinking about moving. But as it developed, I was asked to go to Indianapolis to meet Miles Brand. And the reason I went was that I was fascinated by his career. Many of you may or may not know that Miles Brand was the president that ultimately terminated the contract of Bobby Knight at IU. And I recall one day going into my office at Virginia Union and looking at the Chronicle of Higher Education and seeing a picture of Miles Brand being hung in effigy because of that decision. And I thought to myself, and I thought I had problems. And so I was fascinated by his career and the challenges around athletics that he had encountered. So I thought, this is an opportunity to go out and meet with Dr. Brand. Well, little did I know that when we met, there was almost instant chemistry. And but even at that, I still told him that I couldn't take the position. Now, fast forward a few weeks after that was communicated, my wife, and we have 3 daughters, we went out after church for a brunch. So we're sitting there eating, and my girls decide they want to talk about why I didn't go to take a job at the NCAA. And so I explained to them the various reasons and where I was in terms of my own career path that really had not figured into it. And one of my daughters said, Dad, how would our lives have been different if you took the job at the NCAA? And I'm sure President Casey and Robin can attest to the nature and the intensity of a college or university presidency. It truly is a 24-hour, 7 days a week job. Because even when I got home, there were always telephone calls or interruptions or something would happen that I would have to respond to. And so I said, well, you know, girls, I probably would have had more time to get to some more of those basketball games, soccer games, volleyball games. All 3 of our girls were athletically involved. And then came the $64,000 question. And that was, Dad, if you had taken that job, would we have been able to get a dog? You see, in my household, all 3 of my girls wanted a dog. And I had been adamant about saying no, because I said, it'll come into the house as a puppy. Everyone will love it. It will grow up to be a dog, and it becomes my dog. And I don't have time to take care of a dog. So I said to them, I said, well, you know, if I had taken that job, I think we could have gotten a dog. And they said, well, why didn't you take that job? Well, a couple of weeks after that, the search firm calls me again, and I share with him this story of a conversation with my daughters. And he said, well, Bernard, would you reconsider? And I said, there's no way I'm going to open that wound again, because it had been very public that the offer had been made. It had been very public with my board that I decided to stay. And he said, well, take a week and think about it. And I thought about it. And I thought about something that Miles Brand said to me in the conversation that I had with him, and that was, why did you take this job? And he said to me, and one of the reasons, just one of the reasons was, he said, I want to get my life back. And I thought about that, and I thought about all of the games I had missed of my children, and all the events that I could not show up for because we had very young children. In fact, our oldest daughter was 1.5 when I started my first presidency. So they all had grown up with that lifestyle and that environment. And I thought how supportive my family had been of my career. So maybe it was time for me to give something back to them. And I wanted to strike more balance in my life. And so after much soul searching, the most difficult conversation I had was with my board chair when I said, this is not about being at this institution or anything that it's lacking, but I'm doing this because I want to be more supportive and involved in my children's life. And I tell that story because I talked particularly with younger professionals and stressed to them the importance of balance, having balance in your life, having balance between your career aspirations and your family and your personal life. And if you can strike that balance, you're going to be far more efficient and productive in your career aspirations. And so I called back the search firm on that Friday and said, if Miles still wants me, I'll take the job. And that was Friday afternoon. Saturday morning, Miles called me, and Monday morning, I had a contract. And so I've been at the NCAA now for 9 years. As I mentioned, when I first went there to the national office, I was senior vice president for governance and membership. A few years into that, Miles asked me to take over what was then known as our educational services area, now known as student athlete affairs. And then no good deed goes unpunished. He asked me then to take over and oversee also the Office of Diversity. And with that came about 4 years ago, promotion to executive vice president of the NCAA. I oversee the largest administrative unit within the national office. There are about 450 to 500 employees at the national office, and the area that I oversee has about 225 individuals. Someone asked me today, I believe it was Brandon, the reporter, to actually tell him about what's my day like. During these times, I can say it's been quite interesting, and hopefully we'll talk a little bit more about that. But I do a lot of project management. I do a lot of work with college and university presidents. I serve as the primary liaison to the executive committee, which is the highest policy-making entity within the NCAA, so I work a great deal with policy. But I'm extremely excited about the opportunity and the challenges that I have faced during the past 9 years. With that said, what I want to do with the few minutes that I have with you tonight in terms of just talking to you is talk a little bit about the history of the NCAA. And then I want to talk a little bit about some of the current issues in the landscape of intercollegiate athletics. But I also want to focus on the unique characteristics of Division III, of which McDaniel College is a proud and historic member of that particular division. I always like talking about the history first because I'm a lover of history. In fact, one of my favorite quotes is this whole notion that the historian is the prophet who looks backwards. And why I like that is because in order to understand where any institution is in a certain place and time, how its mission has evolved, how it has become more defined, how it has changed, you have to go back and look at its very beginning. And so that's why I think it's important to understand the history of the NCAA. During the early 1900s, there was a football formation known as the flying wedge. And the flying wedge was in essence where the team would form this wedge and place in the middle of the wedge the individual who carried the ball, and they would run down the field trying to score. Now, of course, this was during a time where you didn't have all of the protective uniforms and equipment that we have today. You don't have the commitment and concern about the health and safety of student athletes. And what happened because of this formation is that there were a number of student athletes who were critically injured, and there were numerous deaths playing the sport. It became so much a national crisis that then the President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, convened a meeting of selected college and university presidents to the White House, and in essence delivered this message: either you clean up the sport, or I'm going to move to banish playing football in higher education in this country. It was that particular impetus that caused 28 presidents in 1905 to gather at NYU, in fact, and to form what we now know as the National Collegiate Athletic Association. That 28 membership has grown to now over 1,200 active members within the NCAA. Now, I mention that because when it's all said and done, regardless of how the media may paint the NCAA, our genesis, our foundation as an organization is built on our commitment to student-athlete well-being. That's why we were founded, and that's why we exist even today. Now, as it progressed, we began to look at issues related to recruiting, financial aid, and the ability to establish some integrity in various sports programs. Because there was a time where we really had professional student athletes. You would have a student athlete play on one team one week, travel to another city, play on another team the next week. And that was how things were operating at that particular time. And so the NCAA began to pass a legislation. One of the things that I think it's important to point out, and perhaps to kind of disambiguate some of the terms, but so often people say, I'm in a group such as this speaking to the membership, and they will say, the NCAA does this, or the NCAA should do that. And I will respond by saying, you're not looking at the NCAA. I'm looking at the NCAA. We are a membership-led organization. So any of the rules and regulations that are adopted by the various divisions are adopted because of membership direction. I think that's important to note because as we look for the various changes that are taking place in the landscape of intercollegiate athletics, a lot of what has to be accomplished has to be achieved through the membership. We see now that as the 2000 year came into place, there was increased emphasis on presidential leadership of intercollegiate athletics. Prior to that time, all of the presidents of the NCAA had been former athletic directors. And so now with the election of Miles Brand, it was a very clear message being conveyed to the membership that presidents were going to become more actively engaged in the leadership of issues related to intercollegiate athletics. Now, that kind of reform movement has really moved towards the focus on academic achievement. It is not an oxymoron to talk about the academic achievement of student athletes. You can excel in the classroom as well as on the field of competition. And so we've seen a lot of the legislation, particularly in Division I, that has focused on academic reform. Now we see that we're going into an era where folks are very much concerned about some of the spiraling costs that have been associated with intercollegiate athletics and looking at ways in which those costs might begin to be reduced as it relates to overall athletic programs. And there's a number of pieces of legislation that has been proposed in Division I to begin to look at the whole issue of the cost of intercollegiate athletics. Now, that said, there were only 7 football subdivisions, which would be kind of what we would think of the 65 or 70 major athletic programs in the country, that actually returned a revenue beyond expenses. So the vast majority of higher education subsidizes athletics. And obviously there is a reason, because institutions see the value, the merit in intercollegiate athletics. They recognize that intercollegiate athletics is a great venue for developing leadership. Arnie Duncan spoke at our convention both this year and last year, but one of the things that he said last year that really struck me, and he said because we have over 400,000 student athletes, we have probably the second largest leadership development program outside of the military. Because really what we're doing is that we are creating the next generation of leadership. And as I talk to the student athletes here, I've been extremely impressed with their passion, their commitment, the commitment to academic excellence and success. And I really believe that when we talk about the student athlete today, that that's who we're really talking about. We do a great job, I think, particularly promoting the high-profile programs. But as I was saying at lunch today, when you look at the sheer numbers, the vast majority of student athletes in the NCAA come from Divisions 2 and 3. The largest division within the NCAA of over 427 institutions are Division 3 institutions. And so I think we have to do a much better job, and I'm particularly excited about the initiative that has been born in Division 3 in terms of identity. And why I really like that is because it talks about the importance of discovering, developing, and being dedicated. And when I think about the student athletes I met today here at McDaniel, that really resonates with me, because the individuals I met today were about discovering, developing, and being dedicated. I think it's important to point out that in Division 3, student athletes have a really comprehensive educational experience. It's a more holistic approach to education and a greater integration between athletics and academics. About 1/4 of all students at Division 3 institutions participate in athletics. And in some cases, I've seen it as high as almost 50% at some institutions in terms of athletic participation by students in programs. And I think that's important to note because, again, that creates a certain culture on your campus where you have that kind of commitment both to athletics and to education. Student athletes at Division 3 institutions are subject to the same admission criteria as all other students. They must meet those requirements. They're not given any kind of special housing for student athletes or services or support from their institution different from what other students or student groups receive. There is an academic focus at Division 3 institutions for student athletes that I think is unparalleled when we begin to look at the landscape of intercollegiate athletics. Student athletes most often select their institution not solely because of the athletic program, but because of the academic majors and the academic quality of the institution. There is available financial aid, and while Division 3 does not award athletic scholarship, 3/4 of all Division 3 student athletes receive some form of grant or non-athletic scholarship. Student athletes have equal access to financial aid as the general student body, but are not awarded aid based on their athletic leadership abilities or performance or participation. As I mentioned, Division 3 does not award athletic scholarships, but oftentimes I think that without that athletic scholarship obligation, student athletes can emphasize academics, athletics, and other opportunities of college life because it is a holistic experience that we want for our student athletes. There are extremely competitive programs, athletic programs, within Division 3. And while student athletes do not receive any kind of monetary incentive for their participation to play sports in college, and I know I'm preaching to the choir when I say this to student athletes who are present, but they participate because of their love, their passion for the sport that they are engaged in. They push themselves to be the very best. But they also, by doing that, create a very intense competitive athletic environment for all who participate. There are wonderful national championship opportunities. There are over 172,000 student athletes in Division III, and over 150,000 of those student athletes on an annual basis get to compete in 36 different national championships. These are competitions provide an opportunity for student athletes to compete at the highest level and fulfill their athletic potential and their hope of one day winning a national championship. Finally, in Division III, I believe there is a very strong commitment to athletic participation. Athletic programs at Division III institutions are very broad-based, and they place an educational value on the participation in that particular sport. The division has a higher number and wider variety of athletic opportunities on average than any other division within the NCAA, emphasizing both competitive men's and women's sports. There are wonderful, exciting, extraordinary opportunities for student athletes at Division III institutions. And I can attest to that today in my many conversations that I've had with the student athletes. Now, with that said, I think I'm going to stop right there because really what we want to do tonight is to have more of a dialogue. I look forward to your questions. And again, thank you for this tremendous opportunity to come back home.
So I particularly thank you for your questions tonight, and I want to thank Joe Jacobs and a number of our students in the graduate program in exercise and physical education for a lot of great questions as well. So thank you guys for all the things you're bringing to the table. Money, money, money. Lots of questions about the NCAA and money, and certainly, as you said, there are very few programs that actually at the end of the year they show up in the black at most institutional campuses, but yet the media focus is all on the enormous amount of money in college sports. Can you talk about this emphasis on money and how you see it impacting the dynamic at the NCAA right now?
You know, it's been very interesting. We've done a number of research studies on the impact of what we would term commercialism as it relates to intercollegiate athletics. And there is this notion that somehow folks win a national championship and then there's this great outpouring of revenue and dollars to the institution, particularly in Division I, which is not necessarily the case. There certainly has been an increasing emphasis on the whole issue of financing of intercollegiate athletics when folks turn on the television on a Saturday and see 100,000 people in the stadium, all kinds of commercialism in terms of the signage throughout the facility, and then think, you know, why aren't we paying student athletes? It becomes another question related to finances. And the response has been, and will continue to be, is that they are students first and athletes second. Now, some will argue that issue given the kind of time constraints that many, particularly Division I student athletes, may have. We are not in a position from the national office to be able to mandate certain ceilings on expenditures related to athletics. That certainly would throw us into an antitrust situation. And so we can't do that. And so it really is incumbent upon institutions to begin to look at, because the current model for the increase in spending related to intercollegiate athletics, particularly in Division I, just cannot be maintained. And so at some point, where do you begin to pull back in terms of the number of coaches that you have on the sidelines, the number of scholarships that you offer as an institution, the amount of signage that you allow on your campus. And so I think certainly under Dr. Brand and continued under Dr. Emmert as the president of NCAA, that has been the message that our NCAA presidents have been trying to convey. I was telling someone earlier today that the NCAA president, it's not like the NFL commissioner, okay? there are certain limits on the authority because we are a membership-led organization. And so the NCAA president really has the bully pulpit to begin to influence how policies and decisions are made within intercollegiate athletics. And so I think there will continue to be this focus, as I see in terms of some of the pending legislation, to really look at ways to reduce expenditures, but at the same time not adversely impact the lives of student athletes.
The conference situation this year has been crazy, would be about the best way to describe this. Can you talk a little bit about the conversations going on in Indianapolis about conference realignment and teams hopping conferences after 6 months or 3 months? And a lot of conversation has been essentially that, will we reach a point where these big super conferences just say, thank you, NCAA, we're on our own now, bye?
Well, certainly that has been a real topic of discussion within the national office. And I think it harkens back to a comment I just made in terms of the authority and reach of the NCAA president. We cannot mandate or dictate to an institution what conference that institution chooses to belong to. That's an institutional decision. And one of the core principles within the NCAA Constitution speaks to this whole notion of institutional autonomy. And so institutions have to make that decision. Now, where I do think that the NCAA can create some very interesting dialogue is to pose the question. If you are an institution, for example, in the state of Washington, and you want to join a conference where the majority of institutions are on the East Coast, think about the experience you will be creating for student athletes by doing that. And I know that President Emmert has been posing that question to at least get presidents of universities to think about not just moving from conference to conference because of possible larger payouts in terms of television contracts, but really looking at what's the experience going to be for your student athletes by this particular decision. And so that's been our role. We don't have any authority to determine who goes to what conference and when. But I do think it's our role to ask that important question to emphasize what kind of experience are you creating for your student athletes.
Do you think the presidents of the various colleges that have been involved in such conference turnover do you think they're in charge of the process? Are they riding a wave that is being driven by boosters, by TV contracts, and other forces?
That's a great question. My initial response, I think, would be that I would hope that presidents and chancellors are exerting that kind of leadership over their institution. Now, I know in some cases, as you point out, Roger, that they are being inspired to do so because of having to meet increasing and escalating costs associated to intercollegiate athletics. And so in order to do that, then perhaps moving to a conference where they can get a more lucrative television package and payout becomes a real incentive for an institution to look at moving from one conference to another. But I really do hope that the presidents and chancellors are exerting the kind of leadership, and that when those decisions are made, that it's made in the best interest of their institution and in the best interest of student athletes that they serve.
People are very curious about how the NCAA benefits economically from TV contracts and conferences and so forth. Can you talk a little bit about the funding structure?
Yes, well, one of the things that Dr. Brand, and I'm sure Dr. Emmert now talks about, and Miles would say, because I would ask him, what keeps you up at night? And his response was having one source of income. Because all of the income that is generated through predominantly the Division I's men's basketball tournament. Now, while it is extremely a lucrative contract, to say the least, if that should go away for whatever reason, then the structure would be placed in financial jeopardy. And so one of the things that we've been talking about at the national office is ways to perhaps begin to diversify income for the association, which is kind of hard to do when you got your primary focus is on athletics and delivering those particular activities. So I think that one of the things that we have to do is to be very cognizant of the fact that we are very much tied to and we rely heavily on the income. All three divisions benefit. And in 1997, as part of the restructuring, each division, at least divisions 2 and 3, were established a certain percentage that was actually put into the Constitution to guarantee that regardless of what the general income was, that each division would receive a certain percentage from the revenues generated by the men's basketball contract. And so, you know, we're okay for the next 10 to 12 years. But after that, with all of the increasing and changing technology that's out there, how do we know that 10 or 12 years from now that contract or that event or the production of that tournament over TV is going to be the medium by which it's going to be done?
Mm-hmm. Given that investment in the basketball tournament, are you in favor of a similar kind of structure in college football? And what is the relationship between the BCS and the NCAA? Mm-hmm.
Well, here again, I go back to my quote about how the president of the NCAA is not the NFL commissioner, so he or she could not mandate a playoff. Unlike with men's basketball, where the membership actually voted for the NCAA national office to orchestrate and organize a Division I, Division II, Division III men's basketball championship. The membership in Division I has never given that authority over to the national office. So you don't have, at least in the BCS, a football championship. Now you do have it for the FCS institutions, and the NCAA does organize that particular championship, but not for the FBS institutions, which really represents the BCS. But our president has spoken to the fact that he would be favorable to such a configured playoff because it's very clear that folks really want to see that kind of competitive environment established in BCS football. And so I think at some point, and I don't know when, but at some point I do think we probably will see a playoff for FBS or BCS institutions.
I'll shift away from money then, enough money talk.
Okay.
and talk about the Office of Inclusion. Can you talk about some significant efforts that are underway in the area of inclusion in the NCAA?
I have a real passion for this area. When Mark was announced as our new NCAA president, one of the things we sat down and talked about was our current Office of Diversity at that time and its initiatives. And I said to him that we certainly have to be concerned about pipeline issues, creating greater opportunities within intercollegiate athletics for minorities and women. Division III, by the way, has done extraordinarily well because 1/3 of the athletic directors in Division III are women. That's unprecedented in any of the other divisions. But as we talked about, shifting the conversation from not just about creating diversity, but how do you impact culture? How do you change culture? Because some of the challenges that we've seen, even when institutions have hired minorities or women, some of the many challenges that they faced in those environments where there has not been attention to really trying to shape and influence and create an inclusive culture. Roger already mentioned the fact that when I talk about this, I said you can have diversity but yet not have inclusion. And so by creating a focus more on inclusion, we're trying to shift the dialogue. The other aspect of that is a couple of years ago, the executive committee adopted a new framework for diversity. And in that framework, it broadened the definition of our focus along the dimensions of diversity. For years, and probably rightfully so, we focused basically on racial ethnic minorities and women, and we will continue to do that. But the executive committee broadened that definition of diversity and said there are other dimensions of diversity in intercollegiate athletics that we needed to begin to address. So we've launched an initiative in terms of sexual orientation. We're looking at student athletes with disabilities, and we also have a focus on international students. About 8% of our student body today that are student athletes in this country are international students. And I expect that that will only increase over the years. And so how do you begin to shape cultures on campuses that reflect and embrace the various differences that I've talked about on the various dimensions of diversity? And so we really have embarked on this whole new initiative. We held our first Inclusion Summit this past year. It was extremely well attended, been very well received. We've established a series of strategic initiatives for each of the targeted populations that I have mentioned, and we're really interested in changing the landscape, not just increasing the numbers, but really beginning to ask the hard questions about how do we create more inclusive cultures.
Sexual orientation has become much more of a topic in this discussion about inclusion in college athletics. What do you see as the landscape nationally now for the gay, lesbian, bisexual athlete in terms of the ability to come out and the ability to feel comfortable in the landscape of athletics expressing their sexuality?
I think one of the real strong statements that the NCAA National Office did was when we developed a policy on transgender student athletes. A number of our member institutions were really struggling with how their athletic culture was embracing or not embracing transgender student athletes. And we learned a valuable lesson from that exercise, and that was that you have to spend time educating people. And so we spent a whole year, in fact, starting with all of our 3 presidential councils and our executive committee, just educating them on the whole issue of transgender sexuality. And then we developed a policy, and it was quickly adopted by the executive committee, which provides some guidelines in terms of how do you treat transgender student athletes. And we've been really applauded for our efforts to do that. And so I think there is going to be, as part of this initiative that we're doing, a greater sensitivity to the unique challenges that, whether being gay, lesbian, transgender, bisexual, that there are some very unique challenges within the intercollegiate community, but also within higher education that we need to begin to address. And we can't be silent on the issue. And I know sometimes discussions of those particular types makes people uncomfortable, but I think if we can spend the kind of time that we need to educate, and I'm a firm believer that if you can educate, even if you're not accepting, at least you have a greater understanding of that particular lifestyle. So I think you're going to see more from us from the national office as we look at those dimensions of diversity that include also international students, women, and particular focus on racial ethnic minority women. In Division I, there is not one woman of color athletic director in the country. So clearly there's a challenge there in terms of creating greater diversity.
On the subject of women, certainly no law has had more impact than Title IX. Has it worked? Is it working? I mean, do you see this law evolving, or can you comment on your perspectives on Title IX? Well,
and as you said, Ryan, I don't think there's been any law that's been passed in this country that has had greater impact on athletics for women than Title IX. We're getting ready to come up and celebrate the 40th anniversary of the Title IX legislation. And I think it's fair to say that because of Title IX, we've seen the creation of extraordinary opportunities for female student athletes. Now, that said, should we be doing more? Can we be doing more? Absolutely. And so I think we have to continue to be vigilant about our commitment to equitable opportunities for women in athletics. And as I said to our staff, with the celebration of Title IX and its 40th anniversary, it provides us with a tremendous platform to re-energize the discussion around the equitable treatment of women in athletics and what that should mean.
I know that we can't talk specifically about the situation at Penn State this past year because the NCAA has an ongoing investigation right now, and so. But I'd love to talk about your perspectives on trustees and their engagement in the governance of athletics. We've talked about presidents and getting them more involved. Talk a little bit about what you see happening on the governance side with the trustee.
We did a very interesting partnership maybe 4 or 5 years ago with the Association of Governing Boards. And that's kind of the professional organization for boards of trustees or boards of directors within higher education. And they put out a number of white papers or particular booklets to provide guidelines on best practices and policies. And they do one for athletics and trustees. And so we actually went to Washington and spent a couple of days working with them on their most recent publication, which encompasses recommendations from the NCAA. And I think you're absolutely right. I think trustees have to understand where you draw the line in terms of their role as it relates to intercollegiate athletics. Given our Constitution and what it says about who ultimately is responsible for athletics on a campus, it's not the Board of Trustees. It's the president or chancellor, because he or she is held responsible for the athletic operation, ultimately according to our Constitution. So I think boards have to be cautioned about their role as not to overstep into the internal operations of the institution. And I'll just share this little quick personal story. Because when I first went to Virginia Union as president, we had a legendary football coach at the time that won a number of conference championships, participated in NCAA championships, and he was not all excited about some of the changes I was making relative to the athletic program, and decided that he was going to go and talk to the board chair about it. And here was this relatively young president. He doesn't know what he's doing. He doesn't understand the culture. Probably some things you may have heard, Roger, as well. What I found fascinating is that as soon as the head coach left the board chair's office, he called me and said, I had this conversation, and I referred him back to you. And so I called in the coach, and we came to a very good understanding about the role of the president and the football coach. But I share that example because that was a good example of the board chair drawing the line as opposed to getting involved in decisions related to the athletic program, because ultimately that was my responsibility.
Tell us about your proudest achievement since joining the NCAA.
Wow. My proudest. I don't know if it's my proudest, but it certainly has been my longest involvement in any particular issue, and that was the adoption of the executive committee policy on the use of Native American mascots, nicknames, and logos. I have been immersed in that situation for a number of years, and it continues to go on, particularly what we see happening at the University of North Dakota. I was telling someone earlier today that my colleagues at the national office had teased me and said that I should buy a condominium in Grand Forks, North Dakota, because I was spending so much time there, because the university ended up suing the NCAA, and I became the face of the NCAA in the courtroom. I had to testify before a congressional committee on this policy. And as soon as I thought that it was behind me and we had it resolved and the institution was going to begin to migrate away from the use of the Fighting Sioux logo and nickname, lo and behold, the state legislature passed a law requiring the university to keep the Fighting Sioux nickname. We then had a subsequent meeting with the governor, state attorney general, and president of the State Board of Higher Education, president of the Senate, president of the House, and I think there was the sentiment that once that law was passed, that the NCAA would back off of its policy. And Dr. Emmett was very clear that we would not do that. And so they went back to the state and repealed the legislation and granted the authority back to the state board. Well, then I thought it was over. Well, now they have collected over 17,000 signatures to add a special referendum in early May, June, to pass a constitutional amendment to require the institution to keep the Fighting Sioux nickname and a logo. So last I heard, the State Board of Higher Education is actually suing now the legislature, saying that to pass this constitutional amendment or to grant the referendum to vote on it would be unconstitutional because it is the State Board of Higher Education that has authority over the university system. So keep watching.
As an alumnus of Florida State, I can only say I was delighted that the Seminole Reservation was very pleased with Bobby Bowden's winning record during that period of time, so it was very good. We're about out of time, but we have a lot of student athletes with us here tonight, and I'd love to end with your advice for them. You talked about leadership being one of the most important things that is taught. What's some advice you can leave our student athletes with this evening based upon your own life experience?
Well, I guess if there's one little piece of advice I would pass along, and I think I'm saying this because I've been extremely impressed with the student athletes that I met today. And I hope that whatever your career aspirations are, that you never lose your passion, the same passion that you have for your sport. Take that passion and apply it to your life and to your own career development. And I think if you never lose that passion, every day you'll be energized and you'll love the work that you do because you know that you so much believe in what you're doing, and that passion energizes you every day to be the very best professional that you can be. So don't lose your passion.
Well, we are delighted that you brought a great deal of passion to this college when you came as a graduate student, and we are honored and proud of your achievements, and thank you for joining us tonight. Will you join me in giving a round of applause?
Thank you. Thank you.
Sorry. I have a little something here I wanted to share with you. You are actually a graduate of Western Maryland College. We want to make sure that you can proudly hang a McDaniel diploma on your wall as well.
Well, thank you so much. Well, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.